Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second webinar on COVID-19 U.S. stimulus programs and resources for businesses. My name is Chris Marty. I'm the VP of Data Analytics and Executive Education at MSCI. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items so that we can make sure you know how to participate in today's events. Here's a screenshot of the attendee interface for GoToWebinar. You should see something that looks somewhat like this on your computer's desktop. It's usually in the upper right-hand corner. By default, you're listening using your computer's audio system. If you'd prefer to dial in, you can do so using your phone by just selecting phone call in the audio pane, and the dial-in information, the phone number and the meeting code will be displayed for you. You'll have the opportunity during our session to type in questions to our presenters using the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. You can send questions in at any time during our presentation, and we'll collect them and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. As you know, federal policymakers in the United States have passed 3 major spending bills related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Last week, they provided additional funding for some of the programs included in the CARES Act, in the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Emergency Advance, or EIDLE. In addition, on April 9th, the U.S. Department of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve announced procedures by which the Fed will distribute $2.3 trillion in additional liquidity to the U.S. economy. One result of this program, is the creation of a new Mainstreet Business Lending Program that we're going to talk about today as well. Companies with up to 10,000 workers or up to $2.5 billion in revenues will be able to gain access to 4-year loans through that program, which has not yet been implemented. The Fed has been putting together the mechanisms and requirements for the funds to be distributed through the banks. By the way, our speakers have provided us with several handouts that you can download during the webinar. These documents are for your internal use only and should not be posted publicly anywhere. So, with all that said, I'd like now to introduce our 2 guest speakers from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. First, Ron Eidshaug is the Vice President, Congressional and Public Affairs Division, will update us on the CARES Act and the guidance regarding the states opening up their economies. Also joining us today is Erik Rust, Director for the Center for Capital Market Competitiveness, who will discuss the Mainstreet Lending Program. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ron to start the presentation. Ron, welcome.
Thanks, and I am going to start talking about the CARES Act, PPP, and EIDLE. I am not going to talk about the Mainstreet Lending Facility because I don't know anything about it, and that's why I'm so glad that my colleague Erik is on the line, because he and his colleagues have been tracking that a lot closer than I have. So I'll talk about the PPP, the EIDLE, those things that affect more of the smaller business sector. Then I'm going to switch over to talk about reopening and the work that we're doing there. Then I'll turn it over to Erik to talk about Mainstreet Lending, and then we can get into all of the questions. So as Chris was talking about, excuse me, Congress threw more money at the PPP and EIDLE programs. We think that that's really, really important. The program started out with $349 billion on the PPP side. Congress added another $310 billion. Is that going to be enough in the long run? I don't know. I think Congress hedged their bets. Originally, Congress was only going to do $251 billion. They added another $60 billion to try and avoid the program running dry so quickly. On the EIDLE side, that program originally had $10 billion. That ran to ground actually even before the PPP. Congress added another $10 billion for the emergency grant provisions of the EIDLE loan program, plus some additional money for the longer term loans, another tens of billions, 40 or $50 billion in that neighborhood. We've already heard that on the EIDLE side, SBA is no longer accepting applications. They think all the applications that they received before Congress upped the money And then in the one day that they were open after Congress upped the money has brought that to completion. There's no more money in that program for new applicants. So at this point, that's what it looks like. The PPP should be going forward. The idle, hopefully people will start to see some money coming out of the idle program. In the last week, we've begun to hear stories about more companies receiving PPP and idle funds. We think that that's a really good thing. And maybe when we get into questions and answers, we can talk about the specific questions that you have about either of those programs. I'm very happy to go into as much detail as you want. But I want to pivot now to reopening. We know that come a point in the very near future, in some places, reopening has started with the first toe in the water. In other places, that's coming very soon. But there's a lot of things that businesses need to think about before reopening occurs, regardless of when that happens. The reopening needs to be done in a thoughtful, coordinated, smart, cooperative fashion. Clearly, the business community is going to need to play a really important role in that. There's really a lot of questions out there. What resources are there going to be? What type of clarity are we going to get as businesses on the regulatory front, on the legal liability front? What kind of support is there going to be for businesses and individuals? There's things that we need to think about. What do our customers and our employees think about on reopening? What steps do we need to take, and what do we need from Congress? These are pretty difficult questions, and to try and simplify or compartmentalize all the different things that we have to think about in this area, I kind of put them in buckets, and these buckets are the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. So the known knowns, there's some things that are going on out there that we know are going to happen, and we know how they're going to be handled. The federal government, some state governments, some local governments have done a good job and have started with some information. We know what that is and where that's going to lead, and I'll talk about that in a moment. There's a lot of known unknowns as well. There's lots of issues that we're going to need someone, whether that's the federal government, the state government, local government, our companies. There's lots of issues that we're going to have to confront, challenges that we're going to have to resolve. We don't know how they're ultimately going to be resolved, and there's a lot of things that we're going to need to work through to get all that stuff done, but we can begin that work now. So while we don't know what the answer is, we can start working towards it. And then there's the unknown unknowns. There's going to be problems. There's going to be things that we didn't foresee. If we did enough homework on the known and known unknown side, hopefully we can reduce some of that uncertainty, or at least have some legal or regulatory or intellectual infrastructure in place to handle those unforeseen issues when they do emerge. So what's in this known category? What's out there? Well, the White House and some states have started to do some work here. At the very basic level, the White House has had some guidelines. And, this is pretty much no-brainer stuff. The White House wants companies to develop and implement appropriate policies. They want companies to work with their federal, state, and local governments, regulations, their guidance, all that kind of stuff. They want industries to deploy best practices and dealing with issues on social distancing, PPE, temperature checks, sanitation, common areas, high traffic areas, business travel, all that kind of stuff, monitoring workforce, checking for symptoms, contact tracing. I think we kind of know what that stuff is, and we're starting to get comfortable with that kind of stuff, at least from an intellectual level. The White House has also talked about returning to work in a series of phases. And there's 3 phases out there. And right now we're at either phase 0 or phase 1, depending upon where you live and what day of the week it is. And in phase 1, the White House envisions that the majority of people are going to continue to telework. People will start coming back into the workplace in phases, not all at once. Common areas in the workplace will be closed. There will be heavy duty social distancing. There won't be non-essential travel. And special plans and special accommodations will need to be in place for vulnerable populations. So immunocompromised people, older workers, we're going to need to figure out how to make special accommodations to reduce their exposure. In this phase 1, school, youth activities remain closed. Bars, big venues, largely closed too. So we're kind of in that phase now, or at least headed there. Then we'll move from phase 1 into phase 2. In phase 2, the strict heavy-duty social distancing will be moderated to some extent, although common areas and high traffic areas in the workplace will be minimized and remain closed. Schools and youth organizations will start to reopen. Bars, movie theaters, larger venues will be able to reopen with physical distancing protocols in place. And then we'll move on to phase 3. In the phase 3, it's not quite business as usual, but pretty much everyone can go back to work sites. Larger venues will be open with some limited physical distancing in place. Gyms will be open with sanitation protocols. Bars, maybe not cheek to jowl, but certainly moderate crowds and things like that will be allowed in phase 3. So that's what the White House has been talking about. FEMA and Centers for Disease Control, there was some guidance that was leaked about some of the things that they're thinking about. So this isn't gospel, but some of the things that folks are thinking about. And that involves sort of like, the restaurant scorecard that you see in some communities where, this restaurant gets an A for cleanliness. And it's for businesses that have plans in place to protect staff and customers, to show some sort of certification so that customers and workers can have some degree of certainty that the businesses are taking these issues seriously. There's some talk also about retraining, municipal inspectors, local public health, environmental services, building inspectors, to sort of be the social distancing police in air quotes, to make sure that businesses are continue to do the right thing in terms of social distancing, cleaning and disinfecting, worker safety, and those kinds of things. So now, most of that stuff I think is pretty straightforward, stuff that we're thinking about. Moving into the known unknown categories. There's a lot of things that are out there that businesses are going to need to get back to work. And we're really going to need to work together on this. Your association, the chamber, groups from across the country, because getting these details right will be important to all of us. And that starts with getting some guidance on issues like health screening. Most of our places of work don't have much in terms of healthcare professionals in sight. So how do we do health screening with that sort of scenario? What is the role of an employer in providing testing, contact tracing, and things like that? What about standards for PPE? We know that the supply chain and the manufacturing chain on PPE is stretched right now. How are we going to make sure that people in our workforces are going to have the PPE that they need to reduce exposure. And then look, there's going to be a lot of issues that need to be addressed. For our workers to come to work, we're going to need to address issues like childcare and mass transit, because without those issues, our workers aren't going to be able to get into the workplace. Beyond sort of those practical issues, there's a lot in the regulatory and legal liability space that we are very, very concerned with the government getting it right. Health privacy, very, very important. Right now, an employer can't talk with employees about the health status of workers. You know, if the machine operator comes down with COVID, we're not really allowed to tell other workers about that exposure, that this person is sick. Testing and contact tracing and things that need to be in place to minimize the spread of COVID are going to require employers to take a different role. We're going to need the government's help, Congress's help, regulatory agencies' help to address these issues. We're going to have to deal with discrimination types of issues. Treating different populations, vulnerable populations, differently in the workplace is usually a no-no. EEOC has begun to come out with some guidance about reasonable accommodations that will protect different groups, but we're going to need a lot more detail than they've come out with yet. Independent contractors is another issue. If you've got independent contractors on site, you know that one of the tests of whether a person is an independent contractor or treated as an employee is where they get their equipment. So if you start, as an employer, start handing out PPEs to your employees and contractors, are you turning your contractors into employees, and all that means? So that's something that's going to need to be worked out. Issues about employment practices and workers' compensation. I know that we've heard that some states are already trying to create rebuttable presumptions that if someone has been come down with COVID, been exposed to COVID, that exposure took place in the workplace. On the one hand, you can understand the desire to ensure that employees can be compensated and you know, deal with this issue in this pandemic. But on the other hand, what kind of liability does that open up for a company who has virtually no ability to rebut the presumption that someone who has COVID didn't get it at the workplace? That's a really, really difficult thing for someone to prove. What kind of liability will companies face with respect to exposure and things like that? If there is some sort of certification system of places of work, what kind of protections will that have? And then beyond that, you know, we get into issues such as those related to OSHA, where there's been some talk on the House side of having, you know, command and control style regulations in place to deal with COVID-related issues. Now, on the one hand, we need to do everything that we can to protect our workers, protect our customers, protect our communities. The government has done a good job of issuing guidance on how we can best do that. Turning from guidance on how to best do that into heavy-duty command and control. Your desks are all pushed to the four corners of the office, but there's only 5 feet 11 inches of distance, of social distancing from these two desks, so you're going to get fined. Those are the kinds, and what kind of exposure liability does that open you up to, are issues that are going to need to be addressed. Then we're also going to have to deal with who's going to pay for all of this stuff. Certainly businesses are going to need to bear a lot of the costs of protecting their workers and protecting their customers. What role does the government play in ensuring that the private sector protects the communities that we live and work in, particularly for businesses that won't be able to afford the massive investment in PPE and other things? So who's going to pay for all of these different things? That's something that the business community and Congress are going to need to address. So right now, those are the known knowns that we're working through. Those are the known unknowns that we are working through that we're going to need to deal with as Congress moves from dealing with phase 3 in the CARES Act, plussing up the money for PPP and Idle, creating the Mainstreet lending facilities that Treasury is beginning to roll out. Congress, when they get back into town, has a lot more work to do. The House and Senate were originally scheduled to be back in Washington next week. Yesterday, the House said they were not going to come back based on advice from the House Physician's Office. At this point, it looks like the Senate may return, but it's going to be some time before Congress can begin to actually start dealing with these issues. So before I turn it over to questions, let's turn it over to Erik, who can sort of walk through the Mainstreet lending facilities and some of the other things that are for businesses that are larger than the small guys. So Erik, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Ron. Appreciate that, and happy to kind of go over some of the Fed lending facilities and the Mainstreet Lending Program. So first off, as you know, going back a little bit, as coronavirus impacts increased last month in March, you know, the Federal Reserve began a number of response items in addition to zero interest rates, which included a number of quantitative easing measures to help support markets for, you know, treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, commercial paper, and money market funds. So many of these programs were programs that were developed and implemented during the last financial crisis over a period of several months. And thus, this time around, they were able to be taken off the shelf quickly for immediate impact. However, as the economic crisis continued, the Federal Reserve began, you know, considering new avenues and rolling out new programs intended to provide needed finance throughout the economy on a broader basis than the traditional scope of the Fed's 13.3 lending facility purchases in the past, which included things such as corporate and municipal debt. So, you know, additionally, the Fed also in some of those program announcements, they announced that they were intending to establish a Mainstreet lending program to support eligible small and medium-sized businesses through direct loans. So this was actually before CARES Act that the Fed announced that they were intending to do this. So we go to Congress, and as they start to consider the CARES Act, which Title IV provided $454 billion total to be used by Treasury and the Exchange Stabilization Fund to implement lending programs established and administered by the Fed to support those businesses impacted by COVID-19. And so as part of that funding, Congress and the CARES Act did state, based on the Fed's previous announcement that there would be a Mainstreet lending program, that nothing in the act would limit the discretion of the Fed in setting up a Mainstreet lending program. However, it did condition a few restrictions on the funding for companies receiving direct loan assistance, including restrictions on stock buybacks, dividends, and executive compensation for the duration of the loan, plus 1 year. The CARES Act does allow for the Treasury Secretary to waive these specific requirements, but he is required to testify in front of Congress to explain the rationale for doing so. Additionally, recipients of CARES Act funding under Title IV must be eligible businesses created in the U.S. with significant operations and the majority of its employees based in the U.S. Also in CARES Act, they did have a section where the language was the Treasury Secretary shall endeavor to create a mid-sized business lending facility, and that contained a number of other restrictions on job outsourcing and then union collective bargaining agreements. And so this is actually an area which has drawn a lot of confusion as to whether those restrictions apply to the Mainstreet lending program. However, that is not the case, and as term sheets that have come out since passage of CARES Act has announced, you know, the Fed is not looking to impose those additional restrictions on the Mainstreet lending program, and it is unclear actually whether Treasury and the Fed will even go forward with that mid-sized business lending facility that the CARES Act does provide for. So following the passage of CARES, so the Federal Reserve on April 9th announced a series of actions to provide up to $2.3 trillion in loans to support the economy using some of that $454 billion provided by Title IV, including through the Mainstreet lending program, which received $75 billion from the Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund, which the Federal Reserve is then able to lever up to provide up to $600 billion total in loans. So as part of this announcement, we started to see the initial outline of the program, and they provided their initial term sheet for the Mainstreet Lending Program, and also requested comments on the proposals, as well as some of the other Fed facilities, that they've announced, as well as new programs this time around during this economic crisis, which I think has been pointed out earlier. There's a few handouts that we've included that provides information on those other Fed facilities. We'll just touch on the Mainstreet Lending Program today, but happy to answer any other questions later on about some of those other facilities, or any of the things we cover today. So as part of that initial term sheet, the Mainstreet Lending Program would provide 4-year term loans to companies that employ up to 10,000 workers or with revenues less than 2.5 billion. Loans would be originated by eligible lenders who would retain 5% of the loan and sell the remaining 95% to a special purpose vehicle to be managed by the Federal Reserve. And additionally, recipients would have to follow the stock buyback, dividend, and executive compensation restrictions set out in the CARES Act. So as part of the comment process, they requested comments within the next week. So we quickly, worked with our member companies, obviously many who would be prospective borrowers, as well as the lenders that would be tasked with administering the program and, vetting and administering those loans. And so we ultimately submitted comments on the Mainstreet Lending Program in order to make it hopefully more attractive for both borrowers and lenders to go forward. Obviously, with PPP having already gone through its first round of funding, and then it's going through its second round of funding this week, there's obviously significant demand for a lot of companies to seek financing. This Mainstreet Lending Program opens that up to a broader set of companies, but then also recognizes that many of those PPP recipients are looking for additional financing, perhaps even outside of payroll protection, which is primarily what the PPP is designed for. So obviously, getting this program right is something that the Fed and Treasury have indicated that they are looking for our comments. So in our comment letter, we raised a number of various eligibility issues, such as employee and revenue thresholds. Those were not things that CARES Act explicitly required in the statute. Some relief on those corporate governance restrictions outlined earlier that the Treasury Secretary has the authority to waive, as well as EBITDA calculations. A lot of concern about how loan amounts would be determined based on the way that the Mainstreet Lending Program went about defining that, which I can get to in a little bit. Additionally, for lenders, we've touched on sort of the loan terms. Right now, it's a fixed 4-year loan term. Obviously, we were seeking flexible up to 6-year loan terms to obviously accommodate the wide variety of borrowers that would be seeking assistance. Loan sizes, the maximum loan size is 25 million, but then the minimum loan size currently set as 1 million. We've heard from a lot of our particularly smaller business members that that minimum loan size should be decreased in order to kind of reflect the demand from that's we've seen through PPP. On the lender side, additionally, interest rate calculations and documentation issues were also addressed. Won't get into the weeds on that unless obviously there's questions later on. But I understand that for the EBITDA calculations, that was something that this group had flagged as something to seek some additional clarity around. So the Mainstreet Lending Program currently, as set in their initial term sheet, seeks to limit loan amounts when added to outstanding undrawn debt that does not exceed 4 times the borrower's 2019 EBITDA. So we commented that, including that undrawn debt amount was particularly an anomaly in the corporate loan market. as lenders typically don't require this input when calculating those leverage covenants, and the idea that, companies that do have that undrawn debt amount that they can tap at any time for liquidity purposes shouldn't be seen as a detriment to, seeking additional funding, going forward. Additionally, another issue that, was flagged that would be particularly informative for this group, particularly on the corporate governance restrictions tied to direct assistance from the Mainstreet Lending Program. The one-size-fits-all dividend restrictions in particular that's currently contemplated under the program. We've heard from a number of members, mainly REITs, LLCs, and other pass-through entities that have raised concerns that they would be restricted and ineligible from accessing the facility, as they are required to make dividends annually and regularly for tax purposes. So those were two big issues that we raised in our comments and in further discussions with policymakers. And so in those conversations with policymakers, we've had opportunities to engage with both Treasury and the Fed. Obviously, Fed is the Federal Reserve is in charge of kind of putting together the constructs of any Section 13.3 lending facility, but then ultimately must be approved by the Treasury Secretary. So obviously they are working in conjunction and coordination very closely and constructing these programs. So in those conversations, they've made it clear that, Mainstreet Lending, as well as other programs, are new programs that weren't necessarily able to be taken, quote unquote, off the shelf, from the last crisis. And so in many cases, they're building these programs from scratch. Obviously, they have a few guidelines that they need to follow as set under the CARES Act, but in terms of a lot of the operational details and other requirements, they are, trying to find the right balance in, making that program attractive while, obviously protecting taxpayer funding. So they've indicated that they're clearly seeking to make changes to improve the program, and that's obviously the reason for why they went through a notice and comment period, seeking comments from market participants and potential applicants. On the dividend issue in particular, from our conversations with policymakers, I think that they have particularly heard this a lot from prospective borrowers and have noted that they will likely have to do something for certain entities that are required to issue dividends and capital distributions. They haven't specified what that will be, but I think if you look at Senate Banking Chairman Crapo, he has put out some statements on that, asking for targeted relief for those entities that are required to make capital distributions. And but more broadly, I think they are looking to impose those other corporate governance restrictions, which also included, stock buybacks and executive comp, in a more flexible and scalable way. Obviously, there's political considerations that they are adhering to. Secretary Mnuchin was on CNBC yesterday, and he did say that these restrictions are necessary, but I think that they're looking at perhaps a shorter time frame for those restrictions, and then based on the performance of the loan, perhaps phasing those out over time, more on a broad scale basis. But then obviously there might be more significant relief for pass-through entities. And so, going through that process and those conversations, ultimately we anticipate that we're going to see another round of updated guidance on the Mainstreet Lending Program to reflect some of this feedback and changes before it goes live. Obviously, I think we are kind of operating under the assumption that could come at any moment. So previously, when the program was first announced, we had heard from policymakers that, May 1st was kind of the soft opening target date that they were looking to get the program up and running. But obviously, as that date is very close, pretty much upon us, it looks like that could be slipping by, a week or so. Treasury obviously has been particularly occupied with getting PPP off the ground and then getting the next round of funding for PPP and getting that funding to small businesses. And I think that there's been a belief that, Main Street, at least those companies that would likely be accessing that facility, there's a little bit of extra time to buy in before they need to get going. But obviously, we still need to get this up and running very soon, and we've been pushing for a quick start date. Obviously, the Fed chairman, he is giving a press conference later this afternoon following the Federal Open Market Committee. We might see some comments from him on when we could expect further guidance or further details on the Mainstreet Lending Program. So I would suggest, keeping an eye out for, anything that comes out of that press conference later today. Additionally, one other issue I wanted to raise on Mainstreet, as well as just all the Fed facilities in general. The CARES Act also contains, extensive reporting requirements that the Fed and Treasury must follow in running these lending facilities. Those reports are required to be delivered to Congress, as well as posted on both Treasury and the Fed's website. And so the Federal Reserve actually last week put out a statement kind of going into more detail on how they'll be following those reporting requirements and running these lending facilities. And so they announced that that every 30 days, they would be releasing information, including names and details of participants in each facility, amounts borrowed and interest rate charged, as well as overall costs, revenues, and fees for each facility. So that's just something that, I think would like to flag for this crowd or anybody else that are looking to consider accessing the Mainstreet Lending Program, as there will likely be additional extensive scrutiny for those companies that access funding similar to those that we've seen so far under the Paycheck Protection Program. So yeah, I think that's pretty much a high-level overview of the Mainstreet Lending Program and kind of the current status of the program. Obviously, these things are changing, in real time, and we're hoping to get updates, very soon. So obviously we could have additional updates and information to share, even as soon as this week. So I would just caution that. But then, happy to answer any other additional questions when we get into the next segment about that program or, any of the other Fed facility programs.
Okay. Thank you both for all the update information. And we're going to go ahead and start our question and answer session right now. As a reminder to those of you in the audience, if you do have any questions at all, please submit them through the questions segment of the GoToWebinar interface. Otherwise, you might not get an answer, so you may as well do it now. I have a couple of questions that have shown up, and I think, Ron, this first one is probably for you. It goes like this: if the PPP or idle money is going to run out soon, why should a company even bother applying? Is there any real chance that Congress could come back again and appropriate more money?
So I think that's a good question. Number one, on the PPP side, that program ran out of money, then Congress put more money into that. The experience with those companies that were in the queue before the new money came in, they were still in the queue. So if you're worried about, you don't have much to lose by applying. Also, I think what I would say is probably a much larger answer to that. And I'm sure that Erik will agree with me that we've been very, very surprised. Surprised isn't the right word, and impressed isn't the right word either. But Treasury, SBA, Congress, the House, the Senate, the White House have been working really, really hard to make these programs work. There's been a lot of stories about problems with these programs. Running out of money really quickly is a big problem. But I think the degree to which Democrats and Republicans, bureaucrats, political appointees have been working really hard to make these programs work is commendable. It's really, really, really hard to spend $2 trillion or $3 trillion. There's been lots of frustrations on not getting answers, being on hold for a long time, getting a denial even though you weren't denied. There's been those stories. That said, what's the ultimate goal here? Number one, Congress wants to make sure that the small business sector, the medium-sized business sector, the American economy doesn't tank. And they threw tons of money into liquidity to make sure that that doesn't happen. That's a really, really important goal. What's the second goal? To make sure that companies can pay a paycheck instead of employees going on UI, taxing the states further, going on, whatever else. So a paycheck is much better than a government handout. Those are the twin goals of the program. And I think that, there are frustrations out there. We're starting to hear some of the success stories. And I think to some extent, we need to focus on that too. There are businesses that aren't going out of business because they were able to get this rescue loan or grant from the federal government. So I would say absolutely apply. The PPP side has a lot more funding. I would expect that both PPP and Idle, if they need to be, will be refilled. Congress has talked about, number one, Congress was shocked and that the money in both of these programs went so quickly. There was talk, I forget which day the CARES Act became law. It was either a Thursday night or a Friday night. By the end of that weekend, there were indications that PPP and Idle were going to run dry very, very quickly. It took maybe a week longer than it otherwise could have, but Congress came to the rescue. When at the beginning of the crisis, there was a problem because Wells Fargo couldn't write loans because of the consent decree that they had with Treasury. When everybody sort of realized Wells Fargo was a big lender in the small business space, Treasury worked really hard to get Wells Fargo into the mix. When there's been criticisms of the PPP program that only people who have a relationship with the big bank are able to get in, Treasury worked hard to make sure that limit the amount of money that went to big businesses, make sure that there was money for smaller institutions to get to smaller businesses. They also have been working really hard to make sure that Cabbage and Intuit and other non-traditional lenders are able to write these loans that have better access and a stronger relationship with some of the smaller small businesses. So yes, it's frustrating. This is not easy. We're dealing with stuff we haven't dealt with before, but the degree to which regulators, Congress, officials want to make this stuff succeed is important. So I would say go for it. It may be frustrating going through the application process, but if at the end of the day it saves your business from going under, I say you got to go do it.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for the filibuster.
No, that's perfectly fine. It was interesting. I also have a couple of questions that are pretty much related here, and it has to do with the relationship between getting funds via the PPP and yet still having the availability of a credit line. Can you speak to the relationship between those two things, having a credit line and yet filling out an application for a PPP loan? Does one prevent the other? Can you do both?
Yeah, you absolutely can do both. The goal of the PPP is to ensure that businesses are paying workers whether they're doing work or not. The PPP program, so long as you spend 75% of the loan amount become on employee-related expenses, turns into a grant. And there's the 2.5 times salary calculation that's in there. So the PPP is intended for businesses to pay workers maybe when orders aren't coming in, when checks aren't coming in, maybe when you're shut down and no work is being performed, to pay workers. That magic 75% is important. The other 25% is for mortgage, for rent, for utilities, for things like that. But the goal of PPP isn't to be a bank loan or a credit, to help you deal with cash flow. It's to pay workers. So yes, you can, you got a credit line from your bank, from your lender, that doesn't foreclose you from getting the PPP from the government.
Okay, here's another similar and related question. When applying for an idle loan, does that affect your application for a PPP loan? Are they treated as mutually exclusive, or does one prevent the other from happening?
I'll answer that by saying, yes, they are mutually exclusive, except for when they're not. So you cannot use a PPP and an idle for the same cost. So you can't use the PPP to pay your workers and then use an idle to pay your workers. You can't use the PPP to pay your workers and to pay your rent and then use idle to pay your rent. You can use your idle to do some recovery costs, and you can use your PPP to pay your workers and pay your rent and pay your utilities. So long as you're not using the two products for the same purpose, you can apply for the two products. Does that make sense? Is that kind of clear?
Well, let me try to rephrase it. So what I heard was you can apply for both as long as the funds for one don't go for the same purpose as the funds for the other. The funds have to be spent in a completely different way.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
So
yes.
So I did get it right. Okay. Well, thank you. Erik, we've got a question for you here too. How should a company prepare to apply for the Mainstreet Lending Program when it opens up? Is that clear yet?
No, it's not quite clear. As I said before, we're still awaiting additional guidance, and I think a lot of prospective borrowers are still looking at some of the items in the term sheet regarding some of those items I talked about earlier in terms of loan sizes, loan maturities, loan terms, sort of the EBITDA calculations and whether they would be eligible for applying. And so there's still some questions that need to be addressed, but then, going forward, once those details are released, hopefully through additional guidance and sort of a start date for receiving that, the eligible lenders category will, be more clear in terms of, who they can go start those conversations with in terms of financial institutions that can then start the process for starting up a Mainstreet Lending Program loan. But at this point, like I said before, it's been mostly, especially on Treasury side, focused on PPP rollout, but then we're really hopeful that in the next week or two, we will get additional guidance and a firm start date on when those applications will be going forward to help give our member companies as well as your members some more insight on how they can start that process.
Okay, thank you. So Ron, I think we're going to throw this back to you here. Would a working capital line of credit balance be used in the calculation of loan availability under the Mainstreet, I guess it is for Erik, under the Mainstreet Lending Program? Do you know that yet, Erik, or does it take into account only long-term debt, or is it all debt? Is that clear yet?
And Chris, I just want to say you scared the crap out of me when you started asking that questions because I had no idea. So I'm glad Erik's here.
I'm sorry.
Can you say that question one more time?
Okay, so the question goes like this. Would a working capital line of credit balance be used in the calculation of loan availability under the Mainstreet Lending Program? Does it only take into account long-term debt, or does it take all debt into account?
Yeah, so I think that's still, going back to the undrawn credit issue, that's still an issue to be
not determined yet.
Fixed, yeah. But then this goes into the loan term issue. Right now, it's a fixed 4-year term, and we've heard from a number of our member companies that that would prevent, for some companies that do have existing loan financing, some of those loan covenants prevent them from obtaining additional loans with shorter term maturities. And the common number we hear for that is a 5-year term being on a lot of companies' balance sheets. And so that's why we're seeking additional flexibility on that up to 6 years, so that it would be able to work with existing companies' loan structures. So a number of those issues that are still being worked through.
Okay, thanks. This is something that I've seen in the news the last couple of days, and especially this morning, but in some cases, the expanded unemployment benefits and the PPP seem to be working against each other, which might render both programs less effective. What do we do? What do companies do if their workers refuse to stay employed because their unemployment benefits are more generous than their paycheck? Now, I don't think that applies to the vast majority of metals companies in this audience, but it is an interesting question, and it might apply to somebody.
Yeah, and so this is, let's step back for a second. Congress put this bill together within about 10 days. This very scenario was an issue that was highlighted as a problem or a potential problem before the legislation was passed. And yes, there are some instances where someone on unemployment could make more money than they would otherwise being employed. I think the best advice that I can give is for companies to have a dialogue with their workers on these issues. And number one, looking through these issues, an employee that can, I'm trying not to put this in stark terms. If an employer is inviting an employee to come back to work and the employee doesn't go, that employee is no longer eligible for unemployment. You're eligible for unemployment and the expanded benefits if you've been furloughed, laid off, or fired. But if you just stop going to work, you're not eligible for that anymore. You can't put yourself into this potential sort of golden parachute. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts answer. But on the bigger answer, what is the goal of the Paycheck Protection Program? It's to pay workers and ensure that companies are there after this crisis goes. One of the reasons that the PPP was created is so that when companies are able to go back to business as usual and start filling orders and running machinery and running all the office operations, that those workers are there to do that. So workers that want the extra $600 could very well be faced with a situation where they don't have a company to go back to, and that's the outcome that Congress wants to avoid. They want workers to be able to go back to work and catch a paycheck, as opposed to limited unemployment benefits. So yeah, I agree that in your sector, there probably aren't a lot of instances. I think that many in Congress are surprised perhaps by the number of instances or states where that calculation is seemingly so skewed. But again, a job at the end of this is probably better than any other outcome. And so that's why I'm saying I think that this is a discussion that employers should probably have with their employees. Okay,
yeah, that actually makes sense to me. So we have, either one of you can answer this. Ron, I suspect it's more to you, but do you guys have any information on when international travel to Europe might reopen?
So we do not. one of the things that the chamber is doing is trying to figure out all that stuff. I kind of call it the Book of Genesis task forces, because we have task forces that have begat task forces that have begat task forces. Last week, we stood up a series of 4 task forces to tackle different issues about return to work. The airlines are participating in that. The travel associations, the hotels are participating in that. We've got some calls on that tomorrow. We don't have some good guidelines on that yet. We also have a group of task forces that have been meeting for the past several weeks that are dealing with supply chain and logistics, that are trying to deal with those issues. And then we, had a whole other series of task forces as well. So I don't have a clear sense of when that is going to be. And I think that's the best answer that I have. But, except to say that we're trying to figure out what our role in those discussions will be. And we're interfacing with the people at DHS, at the airlines, at CBP, across the government to see when that is going to amp up.
Okay.
And then,
by the way,
also what protections we're going to need to do in the meantime too.
Yeah, I think under all these circumstances, I don't know, or we don't know, is a perfectly acceptable answer, because it's better than just filling in blanks, right? I think that's important. So we actually appreciate your being candid about that.
I think this also highlights why we're probably, Chris, we were talking about this earlier, that you had my colleagues on, Chris and John, John a couple of weeks ago. Yes. And we'll probably have to do another call like this, whether it's me and Erik or other folks a couple of weeks from now, just to sort of understand where we're at and what the order of the day is. So
yeah, and I think we'll do whatever we need to do to keep people informed. So I appreciate appreciate that. We've got time for one more question. And it goes like this: when do you think Treasury will publish the final forgiveness regulations and applications for the PPP loan?
Okay, sorry, gotta go. So I don't know. I think that's a really good question. But this is what I will say. Treasury has been good sort of on their rolling guidance in terms of when they hear problems, questions, uncertainty, they've been pretty quick to solve it. These loans aren't going to be forgiven until after June 30th, so they've got some time to deal with that. And as Erik was talking about, they've just kind of gotten through the fire drill of getting PPP out the door, up and running, dealt with the immediate problem of it being oversubscribed, and dealing with getting more money out through PPP, setting aside the whole issue of idle. In that time, they dealt with the issues sort of the Wells Fargo issue, the independent contractors issue, getting guidance out to the banks, trying to deal with getting information to get more banks and more lenders into the system and things like that. So I don't know where this issue is on the priority of urgent and important issues they need to resolve. So I think it's coming. But I don't have a great idea of when. The advice that we've heard is that if you get a PPP, open up a specific bank account just to have the PPP monies go in and out of, so that it makes accounting for all of this, all of the activity on it later on easier to deal with. But I don't know. The good thing about all this also is, if you look at the law and if you look at the guidance that's come out of Treasury, it's designed to be a relatively straightforward process, which isn't always the place when you're talking about loans from the government. And you haven't really seen a gotcha mentality from from Treasury about, you didn't dot the I and cross the T. I did see the guidance yesterday from Treasury that for loans over 2 million on the PPP, that there's going to be an additional layer of scrutiny. I think that's to distinguish the really small operations from the more sophisticated, larger operations, and to avoid problems of malfeasance down the road. But so again, that's a very long way to say I don't have an answer. We know that they're working on it, but I don't think that should stop you from trying to get a loan or paying your employees or trying to deal with this stuff, because I think that Treasury has shown a lot of good faith throughout this entire process.
Okay, thank you very much. So that wraps up our session today. I want to thank both Ron and Erik for spending this time with us. It's very informative. We actually do hope to have you back at some point. It sounds like we may need to when these various programs get into sharper focus, especially the Mainstreet Lending Program. I want to thank everyone who's in the audience for attending. And if you do have other questions or follow-up questions, please contact us at MSCI. You can direct your questions to me, Chris Marty, or to Ann D'Orazio, who has been serving as our primary advocacy person at MSCI for a number of years now. Once you leave the webinar today, you will receive an email from us, and it's going to include a link to a survey that we'd like you to take, because getting your feedback as an audience member and as a member of MSCI is really critical to us to know, are we providing the right kind of content to you, and are there other things that we need to present that are of use and value? This webinar has been recorded today, and we're going to make the recording available within 2 days. You'll be able to find that on our website once that is available, and we will notify you of that availability. So on behalf of MSCI and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Ron and Erik, thank you for joining us today, and please be safe and stay well. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.